Hello and welcome back to the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Peter Houston, and with the Publisher Podcast, Esther Thorpe, Chris Sutcliffe and myself are exploring the people and products powering publishing, both through these episodes and in our adjacent weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at voices.media. A quick public service announcement. Just to let you know, the Publisher Newsletter Awards are open now for entries until the 4th of April. Go to publishernewsletters.com for categories and more information. We are so pleased to have Memberful as sponsors for this season of the Publisher Podcast. Memberful is a powerful membership solution that lets you offer membership perks and exclusive content to your loyal audience, giving you full control over who has access to your articles, newsletters and podcast episodes. Take control of your publishing business this year with Memberful. Visit memberful.com/publisherpod, that's memberful.com/publisherpod to get started with a free trial. This week on the Publisher Podcast, I'm talking to Esther Newman, Senior Editor and Podcast Host Extraordinaire at Women's Running. The community focus of Women's Running is second to none, and we really got into how the brand is every bit as much about women as it is about running. Esther and I sprinted through how the multiple strands of the Women's Running brand work together, from monthly print to the podcast, social media, Patreon membership, and the magazine's Discord channel. I started by asking Esther what women's running actually is. My starting point, actually almost with everyone these days, is just to try and get inside that idea of what is women's running? Is it a magazine? Is it a podcast? Is it a club? What is women's running?
It's a religion. I'm trying to turn it into a cult. It's so many things. It's really funny because we were talking recently about trying to create a persona for women's running so that we could speak to her better.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic kind of marketing tool, to really get under the skin of your audience. But, we realised that actually, okay, maybe we could probably come up with one or two people for the magazine, but they're not going to be the same as the podcast persona, and that's not going to be the same particularly as maybe as the person that uses the website or the person that talks to us through Instagram and kind of comments on things there. So we have a magazine, we have a podcast, we have an Instagram feed, we have Facebook, we have a website. And then around all of that, there's various sort of marketing tools like email newsletters and various bits and pieces the ways in which we communicate with our audiences, which are kind of varied and much more than you'd think. So yeah, that's kind of it.
You're still a print monthly though, right?
Yeah, we're still a print monthly.
So that's still there at the heart of it all. That's where it started.
That's where it started, and that's definitely its kind of beating heart. Absolutely. And we use print a lot. So not only do we have the kind of once a month issue of the magazine, we've also dabbled in things like bookazines, so we've used the podcast to kind of reverse back into print to see if we can kind of, pick up people that way. So print and subscriptions are hugely important for us as both a brand and a company.
So does that make your job easier or harder? That idea that you've got not just different platforms, but different people?
Oh my God, it makes it so much harder. It's lovely. In terms of the variation, it's amazing because I think we are quite often surprised by our audience. One of our kind of high points in the year is the National Running Show in January. And I had a woman who was really, I wouldn't say antagonistic, but she was She wanted a lot of answers. And it turns out she wasn't even a reader of the magazine. But what she wanted to know was, where was our representation of women who were 70 plus?
Oh, wow.
And she was 76, I think. And I was in a really fortunate position. I was completely caught off guard. And it took me a couple of minutes to suddenly realise that actually we were featuring a 74-year-old on the following month's cover. So that felt like quite a nice sort of win. But we are constantly caught off guard like that sometimes people will come up to us and say, well, why aren't you featuring people that are more like me?
Yeah.
Or I read your magazine and I love it and I get so much out of it. And you think, really? I've had sort of elite athletes who say that they love it for the nutrition content. And I just think, I feel like I'm not making it for you, but it turns out that I am. So this is a baggy response to a very simple question. There are so many people read it. And obviously you can't please 100% of the people 100% of the time. But I guess, yeah, it's really hard to try and fulfill the wants and needs of all of those sort of audiences. But I think because we have so many different ways in which we can communicate to them, I feel like we are trying our best. We're kind of fulfilling it as much as we possibly can.
Do you skew certain platforms towards certain aspects of the audience?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, there's the classic division between Facebook and Instagram. So Facebook is more like women of a certain age. I'm referring to myself. So Facebook's more like, kind of 40 to 60s. Instagram's a bit younger. So definitely those sorts of bits of information are slightly different. But in terms of the magazine and the podcast, yeah, that's definitely different. The magazine is, I think because of its format, it kind of is inherently more formal in a weird way because it's coming out in print. And when I say formal, I mean it's just a lot more sweary on the pod. So we've definitely, the way that the pod has evolved, and I know that we'll talk about this a bit later, it's much more an organic conversation than information that we're delivering to people. And so that just means that it's more to do with the relationship between me and my co-host than it is to do with telling people how to run faster, because that's not our job, because we can't do that anyway.
Let's get into that one now, because I remember I spoke to you, I don't know now, a couple of years, 3-4 years ago. And your point with the podcast was this. Well, there was two things that I thought were brilliant. One was you were fed up listening to blokes banging on about, I think the phrase you focused on was cadence. At the time.
Oh, yeah.
So banging on about the technicalities and techniques. But the other one was this idea that you'd gone into it thinking, we're making a running podcast. Actually, you were making a women's podcast, women's running, and running was the hook, if you like.
Yeah.
But it ended up just being this kind of almost like a conversation between two pals, right?
It's absolutely that. Yeah, it started off as me interviewing people. I thought that was the kind of easiest way of doing it. And my big passion before I got into it, in terms of podcasts, was Adam Buxton. So I loved the interview format. So that's what I was trying to do. Of course, I wasn't anywhere near like Adam Buxton, unfortunately. But I tried to do that. And then I started adding in podcasts where I was essentially sort of training a colleague of mine, Holly, as she trained towards her first half marathon. I thought that'd be an interesting thing. And it turned out that people were just far more interested in those conversations than they were with me talking to like Paula Radcliffe. And I think that's fair game, unless you've got like a comedian or someone that's kind of or someone you really know. Mm-hmm. It's tricky to get that chemistry in a one-off podcast, and you have to be an extremely talented broadcaster like Adam Buxton in order to do that. And Adam Buxton is not interviewing runners, and I think particularly when you got into the elite stage of things, and especially young elite runners, there's not a lot of backstory. It can be quite dry. Anyway, we sort of fell into kind of much more of a pattern. And it was fun. Of course, it was easier because we know each other. And it's nice for people that have listened from the start, because they can hear us become friends through the podcast. Because when I started sort of coaching her, we were very new colleagues, and then we've become friends, obviously, as we've done this more and more. And yeah, it's way more about women than it is about running. We've been having a bit of a conflab off pod because we've had a lot of people criticising the fact that we've been talking too much about running recently. Like, like they're honestly really, really cross with us because both of us are training for the London Marathon. So obviously we're talking about it quite a lot. And they're like, they've had enough. They want us to go back to talking about telly again. And it's like, oh, okay.
I'm seeing this audience as this weird Venn diagram. But it's actually not a Venn diagram. It's kind of three-dimensional because it's like all these little solar systems all sort of running around each other.
A spherical Venn diagram.
Yeah, it's like a 3D Venn diagram. How do you keep in touch with people? And, how do you find out these things? Don't stop talking about running, start talking about telly.
Well, that's through Discord. So that's been a brilliant addition for us. So we have Patreon membership with our podcast. And so we set that up a few years ago and it sort of trickled along and it was all right. And then I think there were 2 developments on it that kind of really pushed it. And one of them was doing sort of live podcasts. By live, I don't mean like actually in person, but they're on Zoom. So kind of once a month we do a thing, but it's just for patrons. And we did that and that really helped it. And then Patreon itself launched a thing where you could just click a little button and it added in Discord as a function through that. And it's been absolutely brilliant. It's brilliant for them and it's brilliant for us. So Discord, for people that don't know it, I think it's got its roots in gaming and things like that, but it's a forum.
Yeah.
And I've wanted a forum for ages. And I know it's so old-fashioned, but for me, if you're offering a membership or you're offering a community, then you need to have some way in which your audience can talk to each other, right? Because if you just have an Instagram or a Facebook, all they're doing is commenting, not, and if they do argue, then it's just 2 people having a spat. And we needed a way in which they could have a conversation. And so one of the ways that we did this, and all of this has been quite organic. A lot of the stuff that we've done on women's running hasn't been by design. It's sort of accidentally fallen into place. And then afterwards, we're like, oh, that was a good idea, wasn't it? So like Discord has been fantastic, absolutely great, because for them, it offers them a place where, and we've kind of, within Discord, it's a really nice, easy to use platform. And within it, we've kind of divided it up so that people can talk about various race distances or non-running stuff completely. So we've kind of got little chapters. They're probably called something like threads, aren't they? But anyway, so we've got all those sorts of things. And for them, it's a safe space, and it's still quite small. It's quite early days. It's only in the hundreds of people that are using it, not the thousands. So it feels quite safe for them. For us, obviously, it acts as a focus group. It's absolutely brilliant. So so that is where we hear them going, oh, it's too much to talk about running. Please talk about Great British Bake Off again. And we're like, oh, okay, right, fine, yeah, we'll go back to doing a bit more Bake Off content. So it's super useful.
There's a technology aspect to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be kind of comfortable at some level with the technology. Does that mean that you're out and about? You're meeting a 76-year-old lady runner at an event, or you're going to do you get involved with clubs? Do you get involved with running clubs?
That's a big question. We don't currently. I have some ideas going forward, but we've got our strategy meeting in a month, so I'll come back to you on it. We love meeting people in person, and so events is a thing that we talk about quite a lot, because we do love to meet all these people. And when they, with the National Running Show and with talks that we've done occasionally, we have kind of, and with running events as well, because with the podcast, we did a trip to Paris to do the Paris Half Marathon, and we've done a trip to New York to do the Half Marathon in New York, and we've done things like the Vitality 10K. So we've done sort of running events where we've met up with specifically the podcast community. I think it does widen out, and occasionally we do get magazine readers who aren't podcast listeners, but it's mostly podcast listeners. And so we have done those touch points. And when we've done them, it's been, completely heartwarming and absolutely lovely. And we find ourselves, the first year it happened, which was at the running show, I think that we had no idea. We just didn't have a clue that these people were going to be there, or that they would want to talk to us, or that they would be, I don't know, in some cases quite anxious about coming to talk to us. And, you know, and we were like, we're not, you know, just two women talking about running, but they'd been listening to us. We'd been in their ears every week for, you know, a year or 2 years, 4 years, or whatever. And they'd come to think of us as their friends. And so actually meeting them in person becomes quite important. And we found it's a mutually beneficial experience. Like, we get sort of all the hugs and the love coming back. So we leave things like National Running Show on a complete high, just feeling adored, but also feeling as though we're doing something worthwhile. You have these vital conversations with people that you don't necessarily get on Discord. People don't share their whole lives on Discord. They're just saying, oh, I've picked up an injury running a 10K. But people at the National Running Show come up and give you their life story. And that is absolutely the most inspiring stuff, because we think that we're just rambling into the abyss. And we hear from women who have, you know, they've been through cancer, they've been through all sorts of mental health issues, they're crippled by anxiety, by injury, by relationship problems, all this stuff. And you hear it all over the course of 2 days, and you just sort of think, actually, I know we're rambling into the abyss, but what we're doing is kind of meaningful for these women who want to feel part of something that is safe and women friendly and supportive. So I'm not entirely sure I've answered your question yet again.
Well, how much of that do you bring back into either the podcast? So do you record at these events, or do you bring it back into the magazine? Or
Yeah.
This sounds really cynical, and I don't mean it that way, but do you use that content in terms of the publishing?
Yeah, some more than others, some events more than others. Some events work seamlessly. So when we've done, like with the Paris half marathon that we did, that worked really well because we did a live podcast recording after the event. And so we did sort of several kind of touch points for the group of women that had joined us there. So we did a talk that wasn't recorded the night before, but then we did do a live pod the following day. And that was one of our most listened to podcasts. And even though the sound recording was terrible quality, and we were recording in a room that's surrounded by laundry, so it was really unprofessional. But because we were giddy with it, you know, we'd all just run a half marathon, we'd all had at least 1 glass of prosecco, possibly 3. So it was quite ramshackle, but it was lovely. It was a wonderful experience. So yeah, with that, we then brought it back into the podcast kind of quite sharply and brilliantly. And with other things, with like the National Running Show, yeah, that goes back into print. We talk about it on socials. That's really where that sort of thing works really well, because, you know, in essence, it's a social exercise. So that's lots of Instagram activity during the weekend and after the weekend. And we talk about it on the podcast forever and ever and ever, because conversations we have do spark ideas for content, and they spark new relationships as well, because that running show it's filled with brands and filled with talks with like amazing people. And so kind of it pops off like loads of ideas for not only what we're going to do next year, but what we're going to be doing for the brand strategically going forward and figuring out what women want.
So again, I'm going to get to the ugly part of all of this, which is money. That's not ugly. That's my left-leaning socialist nonsense coming through. How do you make money from either from the audience or from brands that want to reach that audience? Are you making money on the podcast, or does it all come back to the magazine? How does that work commercially?
Yeah, we are making money on the pod, which is great, because the first year we didn't at all. The first year, it's so weird. It's been such an interesting journey. Like that, the first year, I really had to battle for its existence. You know, it was there just to sell subscriptions to the magazine. We were using it as an extra kind of bit of marketing, really, just to see if we could pick up a few extra subs. And now it's absolutely its own broadcast publishing entity, almost separate from the magazine. The podcast, there's like 3 different ways that we make it commercially viable. One is sponsorship, one is Patreon membership, and one is Acast advertising. Of those three things, the most lucrative is probably the sponsorship. So we work with our commercial manager who it's lovely to have it as an extra thing, because I think it really helps with the commercial spend elsewhere within the kind of ecosystem, because you can say to people, okay, do you want a page of advertising in the magazine? Okay, that'll work to a degree, but you might find that actually you're going to reach more people if you go on the podcast as a sponsorship message. And actually one sponsorship message, what we've learned is like if you sponsor one podcast, you're going to get nothing, zero. You need to be sitting in there for months. So we've learned that. It's a new thing for us that we've had to sort of say, we can't really sell one episode of the podcast to people. We have to kind of educate them to say, really, spend that amount of money, that's fine. But what we're going to do is we're going to mention you at least 8 times over 8 podcasts. Otherwise, people aren't going to really pick up on what you're trying to do.
8 times, is that an actual number? Is that just made that one up?
No, I've just plucked that out of nowhere. I think it's supposed to be 6 months.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
People really need to be sitting in there for ages, so that you know that they're
proper
like,
awareness.
Yeah, because like, some of our sponsors are things like say they're like nutrition brands, right? So they're like the gels that you might have when you go for when you run a race. And for lots of our listeners, they're really only going to be buying those gels like 1 or 2 times a year, because they're like thinking about in the lead up to a race. So you need to be sat there in their ears for those 6 months for them to just, be there like a month before the London Marathon, go, oh, I know that they've got 20% off at Women's Running, and I've remembered that from listening to the podcast. So you have to, that's a big sell, actually, because you're really desperately trying to get people to spend more money with us, kind of thing. But yeah, sponsorship, Acast advertising, that can piss people off, obviously, because it will interrupt, and they've added in there's an extra bit in the podcasts now. So they used to only interrupt, I think, twice, and now they interrupt 3 times. And of course I click yes, please, you can interrupt these people. That's absolutely fine. And tell them about mattresses or insurance or whatever, or the National Lottery, I think, is the big one. But I think what's quite interesting is, obviously we can see how many listens we have. And for the patrons, I do an ad-free version, which includes the sponsorship, which is baked in. So we record that ourselves, but doesn't include all the annoying Acast adverts. And in the first week of downloads, so say we get 3,000 or 4,000 listens for one episode, maybe 50 people will download the ad-free version. So very few people can be bothered. It's not something that I worry about unduly. I think people are so used to hearing those ads in podcasts now, that they don't complain about it.
Do the numbers have to be high for you to make any money on a platform like Acast? Yes,
I think. Oh God, I'm not going to remember the numbers now, because we have surpassed it. But I remember when I was working with a companion podcast, I think you had to be over a certain amount of listens a month, and I can't remember what that was now, in order for the Acast advertising to drop in. But to be fair, our production costs are really, really low.
Mm.
I mean, as you can see, I'm recording at the moment from my son's bedroom. So we don't have a studio. We don't have those sorts of overheads. Holly, my co-host, records from her bedroom too. I think the biggest thing we forked out for is the mics, and my husband does the production for a minimal amount a month. So that's quite low. So for us to make money from Acast, for us to be in profit, it doesn't actually take that much. We're not kind of making huge amounts of money, but we have definitely had a steady and significant increase year on year from when we started.
So the other side of this is the Patreon membership.
Mm-hmm.
What do those guys get that normal, ordinary, unpaying civilians get? Or don't get, rather?
So when we first started Patreon, we were like, right, we're going to throw so much at these people. We're desperate for them to spend money with us. And actually we found that what they loved was these, the things that I've mentioned already, which was the kind of the live Zoom calls once a month, and the Discord as a community channel. So they know that those are safeguarded, that no one else can join those things unless they're paying £2 a month, kind of thing. So it feels like a kind of an exclusive club. We also do a newsletter via Patreon, but I am terrible at the upkeep of that. But I do offer that. And we use them, as I say, we use them as a focus group. So they tend to hear about things first. So if we are doing an event,
Right.
I chat about stuff there. They find out about me and Holly's kind of ups and downs first ahead of it, because we write about it. Patreon's great because it has a sort of a newsletter sort of aspect to it. So I can drop an email in and it just goes straight out to everyone that subscribes. And I mean, there's some various other bits that we do. So as soon as they've paid their £2 a month, we send out an email to them automatically, which has various links of free things that they get. So there's a kind of, there's a training plan, or there's loads of training plans they can access, but there's also like a strength workout guide and things like that. So that is as a given. And now, I mean, because it's been like this for quite a while, for like maybe 18 months, 2 years, that we've been offering the same sort of value. And so I think going forward, we're going to be thinking about how to grow the Patreon. At the moment, it's lovely and it's reliable and it's a nice monthly income. It doesn't match what we get from Acast. So I think that actually a lot of our strategy over the next year will be how to nurture the people that we've already got and how to bring more people into the fold by offering more value. But more value, as you know, is more time. So it's trying to figure that one out.
Well, £2 a month sounds like a bargain, to be honest.
You'd think, wouldn't you? Yeah.
It's a difficult one, knowing what people actually value. I'm guessing, listening to you, if someone had said to you, oh, we'll have a Patreon and, sort of come for the running, stay for the community. A couple of years ago, you might have been no. But actually, these days, it sounds like it is. The community aspect of it is definitely a huge part.
Oh, it's massive. It's massive. And again, this, I think, was one of those things that was slightly more organic than by design. It was the kind of the realization after we launched the podcast of the value that women find in community with running. Women aren't joining in real life running groups to get faster times. They're doing it for the social aspect. I mean, there are lots of women that do join running groups for faster times, and they're kind of running around tracks and doing ridiculous speeds and things, and that's and they go for it. But I think people mostly join our community because they want to find what they would find at a social run group, and that's what we're kind of trying to offer, really. I think is that sort of community space for them, whether that's via Discord, whether that's just because they can, lots of them might be solo runners. I find that quite a lot. So they're solo runners and don't actually have an in real life club to run with. But what they can do is they can put us in their ears and run with us yabbering away. And it feels like they're running in a group. And then on top of which they then get the Discord and they get the Patreon membership as well. So yeah, it's trying to offer that. It's kind of, I think when we spoke before, I was talking about that sort of accidental realization of that kind of importance of community, and when we stumbled on it, it was like, oh yeah, of course women that run want to have something to listen to when they run. And actually, I know we laughed about it at the beginning, of course they don't necessarily want to listen about running when they're running. That what they really want is that kind of that nurturing of that feeling of community where they're being looked after and supported, whether that's to do with running or whether that's to do with the myriad other problems that women face. Life, yeah.
You mentioned running clubs, which you said you've got some ideas on, which I'd love to hear eventually. But do you think there's scope there for the kind of community aspects that are also tied into like running apps? Or on like Strava, is that kind of community aspect to it. Is that something that you guys could plug into?
Yeah, I always feel like there's something that's like the little kind of missing link in a way. Yeah, we do actually have a Strava group, and we've got a Facebook running group, and so we do have groups. But I think maybe there's a way in which what we need to do is kind of sweep them all together into one big homogenous thing. And whether that's live running groups, in real life running groups, I don't know. Like before I started with women's running, which was end of 2018, and before Anthem was publishing it was published by another company, and they did have a run series, like kind of running events. And we decided, because it was something that was a lot of effort, and I think it just broke even. We decided not to continue doing that as a publisher. But I think there's appetite for something that's something regular where women can meet. And it's women that know what the other women are going to be like as well. I think that's something about the podcast that's offering it. Yeah, because it's a bit like, do you know what it reminds me of? And this is going to show my age and possibly show a bit more about my history than I would want to give, but it reminds me slightly of Guardian Soulmates. So this like dating app it wasn't even an app, but this kind of, a way of dating kind of 20 years ago, where you knew that you could tick off a few things on the box before you met the person. You knew roughly where they were leaning politically, and you knew that they'd be readers, and you knew that, that sort of thing. And I feel like if we did in real life running groups, that women would know that they'd be meeting kind of fellow sweary Marys, people that wouldn't mind having a drink occasionally, maybe after a run, people that aren't that interested in breaking 3 hours in a marathon, but really want to sort of improve their health, and they need to get out of the house and that sort of thing. So it's providing that sort of space. I don't know if we'll be able to do it. I'd love to be able to do it, but we'll see, I guess.
I mean, I guess I don't know, after COVID, people are more aware of the sort of value of that kind of real world experience. And you've talked a couple of times specifically about online, but you've talked about safe spaces. And I guess for women running, that idea of a safe group is massive. It's got to be huge.
Absolutely massive. And every time we talk about it, it just turns into a kind of a storm, because like going into winter, we talk about safety all the time. But safety is two-pronged, and it's making sure you're not run over and making sure you're not killed.
Yeah.
And so it's those two things that we talk about, and we have to be very, very careful about how we phrase those things, because when we're talking about the latter one, we don't want to be telling women to run before it gets dark and run in groups, because obviously it's not our behaviour that needs to change. It's highly emotive, but we do know that women do feel safer if they're running in a group. There was such a gorgeous woman at the running show who spoke to me, who had accessed our brand and had been listening to us for, I think she said she'd been listening to us for a year, and she hadn't quite plucked up the courage to run yet. So this is a woman that had come to the running show, so a running show in Birmingham, and specifically sought us out, but she hadn't actually been for a run, but she still felt part of the community, which I thought was amazing. And so we were just sort of encouraging, and she just said that she felt terrified. And lots of women feel terrified. I mean, yeah, okay, about the whole killing thing. There is that sort of terror. But there's also the fear of just being looked at and being kind of heckled. That's kind of a big thing. Someone and there was a big flurry in the last couple of days on social media, because someone had inadvertently videoed, while they were going for a run, a woman had videoed a man who had looked at her taking a walk break and said, "Why are you walking? Don't walk. You're running to run and it's like those comments. And comments like that, we know, can, depending on the person you are and the running experience that you've had, comments like that can make you not run ever again. So what we are trying to do is to encourage women to kind of believe in themselves as women and as runners, like whatever kind of running they do, and the distances are irrelevant and the paces are irrelevant, but to kind of enjoy it and to appreciate it for what it is as its own thing. And we're kind of trying to create sort of a safe bubble for them to feel supported and valued and celebrated for their achievements, rather than, shouted at and heckled and put down or killed.
If I come back to my 3D Venn diagram, which I love, I might try and trademark that. If you look at the brand, you might think at the centre of that is running, but actually the centre of the brand is women, right?
Yeah.
And all the other stuff, whether it's nutrition or gear or training or bake-off or whatever, is all tied around that idea of that central sort of the woman that wants to know more about running, but in all sorts of different contexts.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. It all comes down to women. It's like I sometimes wonder with the brand if we're because we put equal value on those two words. And I do wonder if we need to sort of diminish.
Yeah.
But I think
should be women.
Yeah,
running.
Yeah, it is lovely because you do feel like, I love the way that we are able to celebrate like all women, all people who identify as women. I love the way that we are able to do that, and we're able to kind of support people on their journeys, whatever they're doing, because I just think it's so important. It's so important for women to not think of themselves as being somehow not as good as each other or as men when they go for their first sort of walk run. I feel like there is such a place for us because other running media things will kind of identify training plans that are so male specific, or features that are really male specific, or clothing that's really male specific. There's only very, very few shoe brands that develop shoes for women first, rather than just Shrink and Pink, which just tends to be like pervasive. So I feel like we're a tiny corner of the running industry, but I think we're quite mighty.
Thanks so much to Esther for taking the time to speak to us. Don't forget, we'll have a write-up of some of the key takeaways from this interview on voices.media. Or it'll be dropping into your inbox every Tuesday if you've signed up to the publisher newsletter, also on voices.media. This season of the Publisher Podcast is sponsored by Memberful, a best-in-class membership solution where the content belongs to you, not to a platform. Find out more about how it can help you diversify your revenue streams and connect with your audience at memberful.com/publisherpod. We'll be back next week with more insights into the people and products powering publishing's future. Until then, keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the publisher newsletter over on voices.media. Goodbye.